Our lesson for today is Chapter 10, the Endocrine System. The endocrine system is a collection of glands that produce hormones that regulates metabolism, growth and development, tissue function, sexual function, reproduction, sleep, and mood, among other things. The endocrine system consists of the different glands named as hypothalamus, pituitary, the pineal body. You also have your thyroid and parathyroids, the thymus, adrenals, pancreas. For females, we have the ovaries, and for the males, we have the testes. The different functions of the endocrine system are as follows. First is for metabolism. So it regulates the rate of metabolism, which is the sum of the chemical changes that occur in tissues. Next is for the control of food intake and digestion. So it is responsible for the regulation of the level of satiety or the fullness and the breakdown of food into individual nutrients. The endocrine system also has a function for the tissue development. It also has iron regulation, meaning it regulates the solute concentration of the blood. Next, you have water balance. So the endocrine system is the one responsible for controlling the solutes in the blood. And of course, for heart rate and blood pressure regulation, which helps you prepare the body for physical activities. You also have the control of blood glucose and other nutrients. So basically, blood glucose is the sugar in your blood. Next is for the control of reproductive functions, which are actually different when it comes to the female and the male reproductive systems. And then for uterine contractions and milk releases, mainly for the women, so especially during the delivery and release of milk from the breast of lactating females. And then lastly, we have the immune system regulation. So it controls the production and functions of your immune cells. So the components of the endocrine system, of course, you have the endocrine glands. Without the endocrine glands, of course, you'll not be able to have organs in your body that would release the needed neurotransmitters or maybe hormones that would actually help when it comes to the function of your body. So this endocrine gland secretes their product directly into the bloodstream rather than into a duct. So secretions are the minute chemical signals called hormones, which travel to specific sites called target tissues or your effector organs. So in this in the endocrine system, we also have what we call the chemical signals. So these molecules are released from one location and move to another location, and of course they produce a response. So this is how the endocrine system actually works. So from the glands, you have the they release the hormones, and of course those hormones are being carried to, or they are being sent into effector organs or target tissues. So the different types of chemical signals, first we have the intracellular. When you say intracellular, this is happening within the cell. So it produced in one of part of a cell and move to another part of the same cell. But when you say intercellular, so these are chemical signals between different or same cells. Okay, so they are released from one cell and then bind to receptors onto another cell. So types of the intercellular signals include what you call your autocrine. It is released by cells and have a local effect on the same cell. So examples are eicosanoids. So they are released in response to your inflammation. And these eicosanoids are actually signaling molecules made by the enzymatic or non-enzymatic oxidation of arachidoic acid or other polyunsaturated fatty acids that are similar to the arachidonic acid. And then next, you have your paracrine. They are released by the cells that affect other cell types in close proximity. So for example, you have your somatostatin. So this inhibits your insulin secretion. For the types of intercellular signals, first we have your neurotransmitter and neuromodulators. So these are being secreted by your nerve cells, and of course they are very important when it comes to the nerve system function. Next, you have your pheromones. These are secreted into the environment and modify behavior and physiology of other individuals with the same species. So for example, when women and menstrual cycles. So basically, pheromones, ito yung sinasabi natin na parang amoy ng kapwa nating species. Diba sabi nga natin, kapag ka ang isang tao ay mabango, we tend to be attracted to them. Minsan naman kapag ka, actually kahit sa mga animals, no, meron silang mga tinatawag na pheromones. Kaya nga kapag nakikita nyo minsan yung mga dogs, or mga cats, diba, inaamoy nila yung kapwa nila aso or kapwa nila pusa. Okay? But then, pagka sa human naman, syempre hindi naman, um, it is not very normal for us na makakakita tayo ng kapwa nating tao and then ini-sniff natin sila or inaamoy natin sila. But then again, there are certain smell na nare-release ang katawan natin na nagbibigay sa kanila ng idea kung anong meron sa kalagayan or kung ano yung meron sa situation ng body natin. 'Di ba nga ang babies, 'di ba? For example, you have the babies. Ang babies napakababango nila. 'Di ba? Kahit na hindi mo sila lagyan ng pabango or hindi mo sila lagyan ng powder, they smell good. Okay? Pero pagkadating naman kapag ka medyo oldie na, alam na natin na kapag ka medyo matanda ng isang tao, nag-iiba din yung amoy. So, parang ganun ang function ng mga pheromones sa katawan natin. Okay? And then next we have the hormones and neurohormones. So they are secreted in the blood and bind to receptor sites. So again, there's an inclusion again of receptor binding cells. Okay, like your epinephrine and your insulin. So this is a summary of the types of the intercellular signals and how they actually or how this secretions affect the cell or maybe other cells within their proximities. Okay, so again, we have the autocrine chemical signals which are secreted in local areas. So ang naapektuhan lang ng mga autocrine chemical signals ay mga same types of cell within a local area. And then kapag paracrine naman, they are produced by a wide variety of tissues and secreted into tissue spaces. And other effects can be or the effects of these paracrine chemical signals can be directed to other types of cells. Okay, and then for hormones, they are secreted into the bloodstream by specialized cells. And then you also have the neurohormone. Again, these are released by your by the neurons and functions as a hormone. And then you have the neurotransmitter. These are produced by neurons and secreted to extracellular spaces. And then the pheromones, which are secreted into the environment. So for the components of hormones, first they do have what we call the receptor site. So this is actually the location on a cell where hormones bind. So it is basically, in layman's term or in comparison, ito yung lock. Okay? And then you also have the target tissues. So these are a group of cells that respond to the specific hormones. And you also have the quality of specificity. So, specific hormones bind to specific receptor sites. So, ito yung matagal na natin pinag-aaralan na kapag ka hindi para sa'yo or hindi para sa isang receptor ang isang specific neurotransmitter or specific hormone, hindi sila magbabind. Unless the hormones are very specific to those receptor sites, tsaka lang sila magbabind together. So this is an example of the target cell response to hormones. So hormones are secreted into the blood and distributed throughout the body, where they diffuse from the blood into the interstitial fluid. So with this one, only the target cells have receptors to which hormones can bind. Therefore, even though a hormone is distributed throughout the body, only target cells for that hormone can respond to it. Okay, so you see here the example or the picture. Of course, the hormones are represented by the orange figure from the capillary. So once they are secreted into the from the bloodstream, you see here that the target cells do have their receptors. So hindi siya nagbabind dun sa mga cells na different types of receptor yung meron sila. Okay? So next, receptors and specificity of receptor sites. So hormones bind to receptor molecules, and the shape and chemical characteristics of each receptor site allow certain hormones that have a compatible shape and compatible chemical characteristics to bind to it and not others. So this relationship is what we call na specificity. Okay? So katulad niyan, you have the receptor protein, the yellow one. So if there are three different hormones that are present in the um, extracellular matrix, of course, kung sino lang yung may tamang shape, okay, siya lang yung makakadikit dun sa receptor site. Okay? And how does this work? So hormones are secreted by the endocrine glands directly into the bloodstream. So napag-aralan na natin before kung paano ba yung different ways ng mga glands, no? Kung ito ba o yung mga neurotransmitter or hormones ba ay nare-release through bloodstream or pwede bang directly to the extracellular matrix sila or may mga dinadaanan pa silang ducts. Okay, ito yung mga duct and ductless glands, right? So hormones travel to all parts of the body. So hormones are depicted as the keys, and then the receptor sites are the lock. Okay, so hormones bind to receptor sites on target tissues. So yung keys na para magbukas is the hormones and the receptor site is the lock. And then of course, once na nagkaroon na ng specific joining or compatible si hormones and receptor sites, of course, the response occur. So how do hormones cause change? So when hormones are present, first, it can alter cell activity of target tissues by increasing or decreasing the cell's normal processes. It can also cause a change in the permeability of the cell membrane by opening and closing the ion channels. So katulad ng mga dinidiscuss na natin ng mga nakaraan, kailangan si hormone or si neurotransmitter na present sa matrix ay laging compatible with your receptors. Okay? And then also, it causes changes when it comes to the synthesis of your proteins. So the membrane-bound receptors that control the enzyme activity. So first, the membrane-bound receptor is associated with an enzyme at the inner surface of the cell membrane, and when the receptor site at the outside of the cell membrane is not occupied by a hormone, the enzyme remains inactive. So, ang sinasabi lang dito na kapag ka walang hormone na dumidikit dun sa membrane-bound receptors, of course, that enzyme, yung nakikita nyo na inactive enzyme sa baba, this one, okay? So, kapag yan, okay, kapag ito, hindi nakadikit si hormone sa kanyang receptor site, ang enzyme na ito ay laging inactive. Okay? But once a hormone attaches to what you call your membrane-bound receptors, the enzyme becomes activated. Okay, so that's how you know what a membrane-bound receptor enzyme activity looks like. Okay, so for the types of hormones, first we have your water-soluble type of hormones. So it includes proteins, peptides, amino acids, and these are actually the most common types of hormones. So example would be your growth hormone and your antidiuretic and prolactin hormones. Okay, so the next one would be your lipid hormones. So these are the fat-soluble type of hormones. So it includes steroids and eicosanoids. So we have LH, which means luteinizing hormones. FSH is follicle stimulating hormone, and you also have your androgens. Okay, so based on the name itself, when you say water soluble, they can be diluted with water. Kapag ka naman lipid soluble or lipid hormones or water or fatty acid na mga types of hormones, of course, they can be mixed up with fats, okay, or lipids. So this is naman the membrane bound and with the combination of your intracellular receptors. So hormones that are large and water-soluble interact with membrane-bound receptors that extend across the cell membrane and have receptor sites exposed to the outer surface of the cell membrane. So the portion of the receptor inside the cell produces the response. So again, the outer part of your cell or the cell membrane, dito nakikita or sa labas nakikita yung mga water-soluble hormones. And then of course the part wherein your hormones would attach to your receptor sites. And then the responses, mangyayari siya dito sa loob ng cell. Okay? So small lipid-soluble hormones diffuse through the cell membrane and combine with the receptor sites of intracellular receptors. The combination of hormones and receptors produces a response. So, kapag ka naman lipid-soluble, di ba nga guys, ang cellular membrane natin ay gawa sa phospholipids, right? So, ibig sabihin, yung mga lipid-soluble hormone, they can cross the cell membrane, unlike your water-soluble. So, they can cross inside your cell membrane. And then, dun sa loob ng cell mismo nila, makikita yung mga intracellular receptors, and then, doon din sila magko-combine with your receptor site. Okay? So, again, pagka mga water-soluble hormones, usually, ang mga receptors nila ay embedded mismo sa cell membrane and makakadikit lang or makakapag-combine lang yung mga water-soluble hormones kapag ka nasa labas or kumbaga nakalutang yung receptor site sa labas ng cell membrane. But for lipid-soluble, or mga fat-soluble natin ng mga hormones, since fat din si cell membrane, they can just cross, lalo na yung mga maliliit na type of lipid-soluble hormones, they can just cross the cell membrane and then sa loob na sila mag-a-attach dun sa kanilang mga intracellular receptors. Okay? Next is the regulation or control of hormones. So how do we regulate and control them in our body? So first, we have what you call your humoral stimuli. So blood-borne chemicals can actually directly stimulate the release of some hormones in our body. So these chemicals are actually referred to as your humoral stimuli because they can circulate in the blood. And when you say humoral, it is more about the body fluids, including your blood. And then next, it can also be under neural control, where hormones can be released following up an action potential or neurons released by a neurotransmitter into the synapse with the cells that produce the hormone. Okay? And then hormone release can also be controlled by other hormones. So it occurs when a hormone is secreted that in turn stimulates the secretion of other hormones. And the same three types of stimuli, humoral, neural, and hormonal, can stimulate or inhibit hormone releases. So again, it can be humoral because of the body fluids like your blood. Pwedeng sila ang mag-cause ng pagpoproduce ng inyong mga hormones. It can also be neural, ibig sabihin may kinalaman si brain, no? Synapses coming from the brain to stimulate the release of your hormones, or it can also be because of another hormone. So, kung may isang present na hormone sa inyong system, it can also affect other organs na mag-produce ulit ng another hormone, another type of hormone. So those are the ways of the regulation of your hormones. So let's discuss what is humoral regulation. So again, with humoral regulation, it is actually sensitive to the blood levels of particular substances such as your glucose, calcium, or sodium. So in this figure, it actually illustrates that when the blood level of a particular chemical changes, for example, in this one is calcium, the hormone PTH or parathyroid hormone is released by the parathyroid gland in response to the chemical's concentration. So as you see here, kung low blood ka, you have low blood calcium, okay? So what happens is that there's an immediate response of having the release of the parathyroid hormone. So it also stimulates your osteoclast, and then of course after the osteoclasts are kumbaga have done their part, nagkakaroon na tayo ng increased blood calcium. If you remember our lecture when it comes to the skeletal system, the osteoclasts are the ones responsible for you to have an ample amount again of calcium in your blood. Okay? But if you have high blood calcium, so ibig sabihin you have kumbaga enough amount of calcium in your blood, of course, your endocrine cell like your parathyroid would not secrete your parathyroid hormones para kumbaga magkaroon ng activity si osteoclast. Okay? So again, remember that humoral regulation, it actually happens in response to different blood level sensitivities like the presence of glucose, calcium, and your sodium. Next, for the regulation, of course, meron tayo ditong nakikita na action potentials in your neuron innervating an endocrine cell which stimulates the secretion of the stimulatory neurotransmitters. And then, the endocrine cell secretes its hormones into the blood where it will travel to its target cell. So, just like what we have discussed when it comes to the nervous system, diba? The neurons, they send synapses, and then dun sa pinaka-synaptic junction, okay? So, pwedeng ganun na yung mga neurotransmitter, ang i-affect niya is yung mga neighboring cells or the neighboring effector organs or effector glands that produces the certain endocrine hormone. So, kapag na-release na yung hormone na yun, of course, it will be secreted then to your bloodstream and it will travel to the targeted targeted organ. Okay? And then next, you have the hormonal regulation. Ito naman yung kapag ka merong certain type of hormone na present sa inyong system, tapos yung levels, okay? Lagi nating tatandaan na yung mga levels ng mga hormones na to, they do also have the capability of affecting other glands to produce a certain type or another type of hormone. Okay? So, in this image that you're seeing here, pagka nakita nyong green, ibig sabihin is stimulatory. Ibig sabihin, pag mas marami yung hormone na yon, ini-stimulate niya yung ibang organ or yung ibang effector cells to produce a different type of hormone. Okay? So, in this image that you see here, we have the hypothalamus. So, stimulatory siya because when it releases hormones, the hypothalamus actually affects the anterior pituitary gland. Okay? So, sa anterior pituitary gland, kapag enough yung nakukuha ng hormones coming from the hypothalamus, magre-release din siya ng another type of hormone. So, etong hormone na to, it would also affect another endocrine cell, and this endocrine cell na to, magre-release ulit siya ng isa pang type of hormone going to the another effector cell. So, ganon ang hormonal regulation. It can be in stimulatory, ibig sabihin pag stimulatory, dinadagdagan. Pwede din naman siyang inhibitory. Okay? So, paano naman natin ngayon mai-inhibit ang mga hormone releases? So, kung kanina napag-aralan natin na pwedeng stimulatory sila, paano naman kung inhibitory naman yung magiging function ng ating hormones? So, first, we have the inhibition of hormones released by your humoral stimuli. So, often when a hormone's release is sensitive to the presence of a humoral stimulus, there exists a companion hormone whose release is inhibited by the same humoral stimulus. Usually, the companion hormones effects oppose those of the secreted hormone and counteract the secreted hormone's action. So, ibig sabihin, kina-counteract niya or ina-stop niya yung function ng isang hormone na yon. Okay, that's the function of your opposite hormone. So, for example, to raise your blood pressure, the adrenal cortex secretes the hormone aldosterone in response to low blood pressure. Okay? So, kung mababa ang inyong blood pressure, nag-act agad si adrenal cortex to increase the amount of the hormone aldosterone. However, if the blood pressure goes up, the atria of the heart secretes the hormone atrial natriuretic peptide, which lowers the blood pressure. So therefore, aldosterone and ANP, or the atrial natriuretic peptide, work together to maintain homeostasis of the blood pressure. Okay, so those are actually, this is just actually an example of how, um, two hormones work together to be able to stabilize the body. Okay, so again, with the presence of aldosterone, okay, papataas na yung blood pressure nyo, pero magsisikret naman si heart ng ANP para naman mag-lower yung blood pressure. So kapag ka nag-balance yun, of course, you have a normal blood pressure. So, paano naman if there is an inhibition of the hormone released by your neural stimuli? So, neurons inhibit targets just as often as they stimulate their targets. If the neurotransmitter is inhibitory, the target endocrine gland does not secrete its hormone. So, if the neurotransmitter is inhibitory, okay, hindi magkakaroon or hindi magre-respond si endocrine gland para mag-secrete ng hormone. Paano naman kapag ang release ng hormone is by hormonal stimuli? So, in control of hormone release by other hormones, some hormones are inhibitory hormones that reduce the release of the hormone being controlled. So, for example, the thyroid hormones can control their own blood levels by inhibiting their anterior pituitary tropic hormone. So, yun yung mga nangyayari. So, kapag hormone to hormone, pwedeng i-inhibit nila yung pagpuproduce ng mga hormones na yon. So, how do we regulate the blood hormone levels? So, basically, there are two major mechanisms to maintain hormone levels in the blood with a homeostatic range. So, the first one would be your negative feedback, and the second one would be your positive feedback. Okay, so most hormones are actually regulated by the negative feedback mechanism, whereby the hormone secretion is inhibited by the hormone itself once the blood levels have reached a certain point. So once the homeostatic range has been reached, the same hormone would actually stop the endocrine gland na mag-produce ng mga additional hormone levels. On the other hand, when the hormones are regulated by the positive feedback, of course, it is stimulated by promoting the synthesis and secretion of the tropic hormones, which are usually secreted by the anterior pituitary gland, and of course, stimulating the target cells. So, di ba nga kapag sinabi nating negative feedback, it's more on a positive, kumbaga positive-negative cycle, kumbaga stimulates and then inhibits. Pero pagka sinabi nating positive feedback, parang puro positive, di ba? Kailangan maraming lumalabas parate or maraming napoproduce palagi na hormone sa blood. Okay? So in these images, you will see how actually the negative and positive feedback works when it comes to the release of hormones or the presence of hormones in your blood. So the first one we have here is the negative feedback. So the red arrows would actually show you or give you the idea that this is inhibitory. So ibig sabihin ini-stop niya. And then for the green ones, ito yung mga stimulatory or it stimulates the release of your hormones. So the first one here, you have the anterior pituitary gland. Kapag ka nag-secrete siya ng hormones, for example, the trophic hormones, of course, the hormones will be sent to another target endocrine cell. So, ang mangyayari dito sa target endocrine cell na to, magre-release siya ng sarili din niyang hormones, okay? But the release of the hormones actually do have two effects. The first one would be a negative feedback, which is an inhibitory going to the anterior pituitary. Ibig sabihin yung na-release niya na hormone dito, ini-stop niya ngayon yung pagpoproduce ng additional trophic hormones. And then the second one would be the hormones traveling to your target cell, which is stimulatory. Okay? So that is actually how the negative feedback loop happens when it comes to releasing of hormones. But On the other hand, as you see, lahat ng arrows dito sa positive feedback, more stimulatory sila. So, ibig sabihin, pag sa anterior pituitary, ang nirelease niyang hormone ay stimulatory or magandang effect sa ating target endocrine cell, yung cell na yon magpuproduce siya ulit ng sarili niyang hormone, and then yung hormones na yon ang nangyayari, parehas silang stimulatory going to your anterior pituitary and of course going to the other cells or other target cells that can be found in your body. Okay? So that's how you differentiate your negative and your positive feedback. So let's go now to the different glands that are responsible or that are included in your endocrine system. So the first gland that we will be discussing is more about your pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is actually found in your brain. It is a small gland found in your brain. Ito yung makikita nyo dito na parang para siyang nakalaylay. Okay, ayan. So it is actually controlled by your hypothalamus, and it is divided into two regions. So you have the anterior and you have the posterior pituitary glands, and it secretes at least 6 hormones. So this is a representation of what hormones are actually secreted by the different parts of your pituitary gland. So for the anterior pituitary, okay, so for the anterior pituitary, you have your growth hormones for the bones. You have the adrenocorticotropic hormone for the adrenal cortex. You have the thyroid stimulating hormone or TSH. You also have the gonadotrophic hormone, which includes the FSH or the follicle stimulating hormone and the LH or luteinizing hormone. And then you also have the melanocyte stimulating hormone and prolactin. For the posterior pituitary naman, you have your antidiuretic hormone for your kidneys, and you also have your oxytocin, which is responsible for the activities of your uterus and your mammary glands. So, kung mapapansin nyo dito sa image na to, you have there your hypothalamic cells. So, basically, this is an example of what you call a neuronal stimuli. Okay, because the stimulus are being sent by your nerve cells. Okay, so for the anterior pituitary gland, the first type of hormone that it releases is actually your growth hormone. So the target tissues are most of the tissues found in your body. It stimulates growth of the bones, muscles, and organs. So examples for the abnormalities, di ba nga, anything that's over and under the normal range is actually abnormal in anatomical and physiological sense of our body. So, for example, too much growth hormone would actually cause giantism. Ito yung mga super malalaki, matatangkad sila, malalaki yung kanilang mga bones. And then, kapag ka naman too little, it could actually cause pituitary dwarfism, or ito yung mga tinatawag natin sa Tagalog ng mga unano. Okay, so next you have your thyroid stimulating hormone or the TSH. So the target tissue is your thyroid gland. So the function is to regulate the thyroid gland secretions and abnormalities. Kapag masyadong marami yung thyroid stimulating hormone, so the thyroid gland enlarges. So may tinatawag tayo dyan na hyperthyroidism. And then kapag ka naman too little yung thyroid hormone natin, thyroid stimulating hormone, the thyroid gland shrinks or what you call your hypothyroidism. So this image here shows you how your thyroid stimulating hormones are being released, okay, from your anterior pituitary gland. So ano ba ang nag-stimulate sa ating anterior pituitary? So we have what you call your thyroid stimulating hormone releasing hormone from your hypothalamus. So this is released from the neurons within the hypothalamus in the blood, and then it passes through the hypothalamic pituitary portal system, this one, to the anterior pituitary. So once it reaches your anterior pituitary, it actually releases, or it bounds to release your thyroid stimulating hormone. So it actually passes through the general circulation of your thyroid gland. So once your thyroid gland is already stimulated by the TSH, it causes now the release of what you call your thyroid hormones T3 and T4 in your general circulation. Okay? So T3 is actually triiodothyronine and then T4 is thyroxine. So together, these hormones actually regulate your body's temperature, metabolism, and heart rate. So once T3 and T4 is already acting on the target tissues, of course, there should be a response. Okay? With T3 and T4, of course, the target tissue again is for metabolism, temperature, growth, and development. Pero meron din silang inhibitory na response. So the inhibitory here is the effect on the secretion of the TSH releasing hormone in your hypothalamus and the TSH from your pituitary. Okay, so that's how your thyroid stimulating hormone is being regulated. Okay. So next we have your anterior pituitary gland. So we have what you call your gonadotropins. So when you say gonadotropins, these are hormones that are found from your reproductive systems, hence the name gonads. So those are the kumbaga, parts of your reproductive system. So first we have the luteinizing hormone or the LH for women, for females. So the target tissue is your ovaries. It promotes ovulation and progesterone production. And for the males naman, ang tina-target ng luteinizing hormone is the testes for the sperm production and testosterone. You also have your FSH or your follicle stimulating for females. So the target is the follicles of your ovaries, and it is for follicle maturation and estrogen secretion. For males naman, it is targeting the seminiferous tubules of the testes, and it is for or responsible for the sperm production. And then you also have the release of prolactin. The target is your mammary glands and ovaries for females, and of course, it is for milk production. Okay, so if you come to think of it, there are actually certain reports na meron din daw gatas ang mga lalaki. Okay? Maybe that is actually something that is kumbaga abnormal. 'Di ba nga hindi naman lahat ng tao kumbaga normal yung pagde-develop. Okay? So there are really some instances or cases wherein men can also lactate. Okay? It's because already of the development of the body parts. Of course, it's more on the genetic side, okay, of the development of a human. So next, you have your posterior pituitary gland. So here you have the antidiuretic hormone. So the target tissues are your kidneys. Their function is to conserve water. Okay, so abnormalities that you could actually experience with this one is the diabetes insipidus. So it just means that you have low antidiuretic hormone or the form of vasopressin. So kidneys to produce large amounts of dilute water urine and can lead to dehydration and thirst. Okay? So kung mahilig kayong mag-inom ng kape, okay, ang kape kasi guys ay diuretic. Kaya nga kapag umiinom kayo ng kape, ihi kayo ng ihi. Okay, so yun yung kabaliktaran ng antidiuretic. Kailangan kapag normal ang level ng antidiuretic hormone mo sa katawan, you still have the capability of conserving or preserving water in your body. Pero kapag sumobra naman yung antidiuretic hormone, meron tayong diabetes insipidus or ito yung tinatawag na pamamanas sa mga patients na may diabetes. Okay? So, yan yon. And then next, you have your oxytocin. This is for the uterus. Its function is for the increased uterine contractions during labor and for milk letdown. So the more oxytocin there is, there is in a mother's system, of course, nadetect kasi ng katawan natin yan. Kunyari, nanganganak ka, okay, siguro mga for 1 or 2 days wala pa, pero nare-regulate ng body na kailangan ng release of oxytocin para magkaroon ng milk letdown yung mother. Okay? But there are also some instances wherein hindi naman talaga hormonal related yung mga mommies na wala tayong gatas. Okay? Maybe meron lang ding problema sa mga mammary glands kaya hindi minsan nakakapag-produce ng milk ang mga mothers. Okay? So this is how your hypothalamus and your posterior pituitary works. Again, stimulatory are the green ones, and then you have the red ones for inhibitory. So first one, the stimuli within the nervous system stimulate the hypothalamic nerve cells to produce action potentials. So again, you have the nerves again. So more on the neuronal na naman siya na stimulus. And then action potentials are carried by the axons of the nerves of the posterior pituitary. And the axons of the nerve cells store hormones in the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the endings of the nerves, no, meron silang kumbaga connection within the posterior pituitary hormone or pituitary gland. So, in the posterior pituitary gland, action potentials cause the release of hormones. Yun yung mga red-red na nakikita nyo from the axons and into the circulatory system. So, the hormones pass through the circulatory system and influence the activity to their target tissues. Okay, so more on neuronal stimuli siya. So, next is the thyroid and parathyroid glands. So, yung thyroid, yan yung nakikita natin dito sa harapan natin sa may bandang, it's a part of, na nandito sa may harapan ng ating leeg. Kapag ka parathyroids naman, apat sila. Sila yung mga nakikita sa likod ng inyong thyroid. Okay? So, yung letter H, yan yung thyroid, and then yung mga nasa likod, mga parathyroid glands sila. So in here, you will see also a three-dimensional interpretative drawing of the thyroid follicles and the parafollicular cells. So here you will see this is a thyroid follicle. Itong isang buong to. Okay. So it is lined up with your follicular cells. And then sa extracellular matrix ay makikita nyo yung mga C cells na yan. Okay. So, under the microscope, your thyroid cells or thyroid follicles would actually look like this. Ayan. So, ang isang ganyan ay tinatawag nating isang follicle at follicular cells yung kanyang mga or yung nagla-line up ng kanyang cell membrane. Ayan. So, for the thyroid gland, this is actually one of the largest glands found in your body and it requires iodine to function. So, the thyroid hormones, they actually target most of the tissues found in your body and it regulates metabolic rates and is needed for your growth. Okay? Kaya nga 'di ba kapag ka sa mga babies din, usually, yan, tiki-tiki, I think it's a form of an iodine vitamins, no, na tinitake ng mga bata. And then you also have your calcitonin. This is for the bones. It's secreted when blood calcium levels are high. Okay? So, abnormalities of the thyroid gland, again, you have the hypothyroidism and you have the hyperthyroidism. So, how will you be able to differentiate them? So, with hypothyroidism, pag sinabing hypo, it's always decreased. So, you have a decreased metabolism, but you will be having weight gain, your appetite is reduced, and you always have fatigue. You also have low temperature and pulse. You tend to have dry, cold skin. You also have myxedema in adults and then cretinism in infants. And then for hyperthyroidism, it's increased metabolism. So usually, ito yung mga types of patient ang bilis pumayat pagka meron silang hyperthyroidism. So, added weight loss, increased appetite, lagi silang nervous. They usually have higher temperature and pulse. They are warm and flushed skin. And then, usually, meron silang related diseases like your Graves' disease, which leads to goiter. Ayan. So, for the parathyroid glands, you have your parathyroid hormone or PTH. Target tissues are bones and kidneys. So, they regulate blood calcium levels more than calcitonin. So, if calcium is low, then the osteoclasts break down bone matrix and less calcium is lost in the urine. And if calcium is high, then osteoclasts don't break down the bone matrix and more calcium is lost in your urine. So this figure actually shows the regulation of blood calcium ion levels in your body. So let's start here. Okay. So in here you will see that the graph shows that we have, the normal range of calcium. Okay. So there are two paths. It can be that there is an increase in the calcium levels, or it can also be a disturbance or a decrease in the calcium levels in your blood. So, punta muna tayo dun sa paano kapag ka nag-increase yung calcium levels nyo sa inyong katawan. Of course, anything that increases or decreases from the normal range of your levels, bodily levels, or ideal component levels of your body would cause actually a homeostasis disturbance. Okay? So, when your blood calcium is increased, so kung mataas siya, ano ang nangyayari? Your C cells or your parafollicular cells and your parathyroid gland actually sends out a stimulus. Okay? So, they are the receptors and the control centers na nagre-receive nung change na yon. So, what happens is that your parafollicular cells increase calcitonin secretion and your parathyroid gland naman decreases the parathyroid hormone secretion. So once a stimulus has been created and has been sent, of course, there's always a response. Okay? So the response would be the effect or the effector organs or tissues found in your body. So sa pagtaas ng calcitonin secretion at sa pagbaba ng parathyroid secretion, ano ang mangyayari? So there would be decreased bone reabsorption and decreased uptake of calcium from the intestine and kidney result. So, once na nagkaroon na ng response, of course, babalik ngayon or magdi-decrease na ulit yung number of or yung level ng calcium and your homeostasis will be restored. Okay? Pero paano naman, ma'am, kapag bababa yung calcium ions? Of course, again, meron tayong homeostasis disturbance. Ang gagawin ngayon ni C cells ay ang kabaliktaran. It will decrease the calcitonin secretion. Kapag sa parathyroid naman, it will increase the parathyroid secretion. Ano po ang magiging response? So, the response of your effector organs or muscles or effector tissues would be increased bone resorption and increased uptake of calcium from the intestine and your kidney. So, as a result, kapag nag-increase ulit yung level of your calcium, magkakaroon na ulit ng homeostasis. So, for the adrenal glands, the adrenal glands are actually cone-shaped tissues in your body, and they are found at sitting on top of each of your kidneys. So there are actually two regions. You have the medulla and the cortex. So the adrenal medulla, ito yung nasa gitna niya, and then the adrenal cortex is yung pinakalabas. So if we look closer or kung i-dig in natin yung parts ng ating adrenal cortex, you will see there that it has three zones. Okay, you have your adrenal cortex zones. The first one is your zona reticularis, and then the second one would be your fasciculata, and then the outer part of your adrenal cortex is your glomerulosa. So the adrenal medulla or the inner portion of your adrenal glands do actually secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine. So the target tissues are the heart, blood vessels, the liver, and your fat cells. And their function is to release as part of the fight or flight responses. So this is actually the regulation of the adrenal medullary secretions. So in here, the stimulation of your hypothalamus, okay, can be caused by stress, the physical activity, or low blood glucose levels that causes action potentials to travel through the sympathetic nervous system to the adrenal medulla. So, stress, physical activities, and low glucose levels are actually types of your fight or flight responses. So, in response, the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and smaller amounts of norepinephrine into the general circulation. So, these hormones have several effects that prepare the body for physical activities. So, again, hypothalamus can be stimulated by stress, physical activities, or low blood glucose levels, or the fight or flight responses. Now, action potentials travel through the sympathetic division of your autonomic nervous system going to the adrenal medulla, and then the secretion of the epinephrine and norepinephrine actually results to the following, okay, target tissues. So there would be an increased release of glucose from the liver, increased release of fatty acids from the fat stores, increased heart rate, decreased blood flow through the blood vessels of the internal organs and the skin. You also have increased blood flow to the skeletal muscles and the heart. It decreases functions of your visceral organs. It increases your blood pressure and increases the metabolic rate in the skeletal muscles. So, ganun naman talaga lagi yung nangyayari guys, 'di ba? When we are stressed, when we have the physical, we do physical activities, so nag-increase yung heart rate natin, kumbaga nagde-decrease, pati yung blood pressure natin nag-increase because of the responses of of the activities that we're doing, and of course the stimulation of the hypothalamus. And of course, the secretion of your hormones like your epinephrine and norepinephrine. So, for the adrenal cortex, this is actually the outer portion. It secretes now what you call your aldosterone. So, aldosterone is actually a type of a mineralocorticoid. So, a mineralocorticoid actually helps regulate blood volume and blood levels of potassium and sodium. So its target tissue is your kidneys, and it causes sodium and water to be retained and potassium to be secreted, indirectly involved with blood pressure and the blood volume. So that's the function of your aldosterone. So in this one, you will see the regulation of aldosterone secretion in the adrenal cortex. So more likely, the effects on the adrenal cortex would be more of a stimulatory effect. Okay, so when there's an increased blood um, potassium levels or decreased blood levels, it would kumbaga madedetect ni adrenal cortex, and it will produce your aldosterone. So aldosterone primarily binds to the receptor molecules in the kidneys, but it also affects the intestine, the sweat glands, and salivary glands. And aldosterone causes sodium and water to be retained in the body and increases the rate at which potassium is eliminated. So once the kidneys detect a decrease in blood pressure, in response, they increase the secretion naman of renin. Okay, again, kapag ka may increase of potassium levels or decrease of sodium levels, si adrenal cortex, it would release your aldosterone. So si aldosterone, it will affect your kidneys and other tissues in your body. And then kapag ka na-receive na ng mga receptors yung aldosterone, it will release the renin. Okay? So the renin, it actually converts your angiotensinogen, which is coming from the liver, okay, to angiotensin 1, and then it is all angiotensin 1 is converted now to angiotensin 2 by a converting enzyme, and the angiotensin 1 or the angiotensin 2 would actually cause constriction of the blood vessels, resulting in increased blood pressure. So angiotensin 2 would also cause increased secretion of the aldosterone. So other than constricting blood vessels, ang isa pang role ni angiotensin 2 is to send again signals, okay, para i-stimulate niya ulit sa adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone. So, aldosterone stimulation of the kidneys causes sodium retention and potassium excretion and decreased water loss. Okay? So, yun yung mga nagagawa ng aldosterone to your kidneys. So, you have the production of renin, you also have the retention of sodium, excretion of potassium, decreased water loss, and meron ding effects of blood vessel constriction, and of course, decreased blood pressure. So, next would be your adrenal gland. It produces cortisol, which is a type of a glucocorticoid. So, it helps regulate blood nutrient levels. So, the target tissue is most of the tissues found in the body. The function is to increase the breakdown of fat and protein for energy uses and reduces inflammatory and immune responses. Next is the androgens. So, they also affect most of the tissues found in the body. The function for males is for secondary sexual characteristics. So, ito yung pagkakaroon ng hair sa mukha, pagde-develop ng Adam's apple. Sa females naman, it's more on the sex drive. Okay? So, in this one, it shows you the anatomy and histology of your adrenal gland. So, ito yung kanyang pinaka kumbaga histology. Okay, so this what you see here in letter C is actually the cortex. So the cortex have the secretions of the mineralocorticoids, yun yung pinaka outer niya. Okay, and then yung sa gitna, it secretes glucocorticoids, and then yung pinakababa ng kanyang cortex ay ang sinisekret ay androgens. Okay, so please take note which part of the cortex yung nagsisecrete ng anong type of secretion. Okay? So this is how your cortisol secretion from the adrenal cortex is regulated. So it has both regulatory and stimulatory and inhibitory effects. So, cortisol secretion is stimulated by the anterior pituitary hormone, ACTH. So, ACTH is adenocorticotrophic hormone. Okay, so in response to stress or low blood glucose, ACTH releasing hormone passes the hypothalamus through the hypothalamic pituitary portal to the anterior pituitary. So the releasing hormone binds to the and stimulates cells that secrete ACTH in the general circulation. So adrenocorticotrophic hormone acts on the adrenal cortex and stimulates the secretion of cortisol into the general secretion. So once cortisol is already in the general circulation, it acts on the target tissues to increase protein breakdown and blood glucose. So it also has anti-inflammatory effects. So other than this one, it also acts as an inhibitory for the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary to decrease the ACTH secretion. Next is your pancreas. This is an organ of the abdomen. So it releases your insulin. So the target tissues are the liver, skeletal muscle, adipose tissue, and satiety of center of the hypothalamus. So the functions is for the regulation of blood glucose levels. After a meal, glucose levels are high and insulin is secreted. So extra glucose is stored in the form of glycogen. So this is the structure of your pancreas. So the endocrine portion of the pancreas is made up of scattered pancreatic islets. We have your alpha cells that secrete your glucagon, this one, And then you have also your beta cells that increase or secretes your insulin. So the exocrine portion of the pancreas surrounds the pancreatic islets and produces digestive enzymes that are carried through a system of ducts to the small intestine. Okay. Yan. So that's under the microscope, it would actually look like this, the pancreatic islet. Hindi nga lang ganon na madidistinguish yung differences of the alpha and the beta cells. So in this drawing, you will see that yan, yung mga violet ones are actually the alpha cells and then the blue ones are the beta cells. So please remember which type of cell do actually secrete the glucagon or the insulin. Okay, so that's how the histological feature of a pancreatic islet look like. So, abnormalities of the pancreas, of course, diabetes mellitus. So, this is caused by too little insulin or faulty insulin receptors. Symptoms would be exaggerated appetite, excess urine, dehydration, thirst, and fatigue. Type 1 is the insulin dependent. So, you would use actually, or you would need to have daily injections of insulin as required. And then type 2 is insulin independent. So, often found in obese people, can be treated with diet but can turn into type 1. Okay, so usually most common yung type 2, no? Insulin independent. So it doesn't necessarily mean na kailangan mo laging nag-insulin. But for the type 1, kailangan na kailangan nila because they don't have the capability of producing their own insulin. Kaya sila laging nag-i-injection. Okay? Next is glucagon. The target tissue is the liver. So the function is for the regulation of blood glucose levels. Between meals, glucose levels drop and glucagon is secreted. So glucagon allows glycogen to be broken down into glucose. So ito yung mga ginagamit natin kapag hindi tayo kumakain, okay, between meals. So your glucagon helps um break down your glycogen, 'di ba? Glycogen stores are sila yung kumbaga unang-unang mga nadadigest or natutunaw kapag nagugutom tayo. Okay? So, sugars. So, this is actually the regulation of blood glucose levels. So, again, para intindihin natin siya, of course, you have here the start. Of course, this one would be the normal blood glucose range. So, when you go up or when you go down, okay, there's always a homeostatic disturbance. So when your blood glucose is disturbed, of course, the stimulus is from the pancreas. So your pancreatic islets detect an increase in blood glucose and secretes insulin. So the response would be coming from your skeletal muscles and your liver. So insulin stimulates glucose uptake by most tissues and promotes glycogen storage in skeletal muscle and liver. And excess glucose is stored as fat. So once the blood glucose level decreases, of course, homeostasis is restored. Pero paano naman kapag mababa yung ating glucose level? So the pancreatic islets detect a decrease in blood glucose and do not secrete your insulin. So a decrease in the insulin results in decreased glucose uptake, increased glycogen breakdown by the liver and skeletal muscle, and increase glucose synthesis. So blood glucose, when increased, of course, restores your homeostasis. For the testes and the ovaries, so for males, you have your testosterone. Target more likely is most of the tissues in your body, and it aids in sperm and reproductive organ development and function. And then you have the estrogen and progesterone for females. So most tissues are targeted and they are involved in the uterine and mammary gland development and menstrual cycle. Next, you have your thymus gland. It produces your thymosin, which is responsible for the immune system tissues. So it promotes immune system development and function. Okay? So your thymus gland is composed of the right and the left lobes, and it has septae. And so nakikita nyo dito ay it is like in between your right and left lung. Next, you have your pineal gland. It is found also in your brain. Okay? The target tissue is your hypothalamus. So it plays a role in the onset of puberty and controls circadian rhythms, and light affects its function. So the function of your pineal gland is more likely dependent of our exposure to light as well. Okay? So this actually shows you how the light affects your pineal gland. So when there are light rays that are captured by the eye, of course, nagkakaroon tayo ng mga neural pathways. So ma-affect si pineal body, magkakaroon ng sending of messages to your postganglionic sympathetic neuron and the sympathetic neuron, and of course your preganglionic sympathetic neuron. So in turn, your pineal body, it produces yung melatonin, which inhibits your gonadotropin releasing hormone secretion from your hypothalamus. It may also help regulate sleep cycles by enhancing the tendency of sleep. And increasing day length reduces neural stimulation of the melatonin secretion. And decreasing day length increases neural stimulation of melatonin secretion. So, kung meron sa inyo yung mga hirap na hirap talagang matulog, no? This is actually ito yung mga iniinom. You can actually drink melatonin for you to be able to stimulate yung inyong pagtulog. Yun yung kumbaga nagle-level ng inyong circadian rhythm. Again, 'di ba tama naman yung sinabi dito na kapag increase yung day length mo or mas matagal yung inyong kumbaga exposure to light and yung araw nyo ay matagal, nahihirapan talaga kayong matulog. Pero kapag ka 'di ba gabi and mas kumbaga decrease yung exposure mo sa light rays, more likely mas madalas kang inaantok. Okay? So yan yung ginagawa ng ating pineal body. And of course, the melatonin production. Okay? So thank you very much for listening for on this lecture. Our next lessons would be for the cardiovascular system. So just complete all of the requirements that are needed for your midterms, and then of course please also start already your endocrine activities. Okay, so see you on our next lecture. Thank you.